Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're very excited to talk about social media use and mental health for youth athletes. Joining us this evening is Kimberly O'Brien and Jacqueline Nisi. Dr. O'Brien is a clinical social worker in the sports medicine division and female athlete program at Boston Children's, and also a research scientist and assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Nisi is an assistant professor at Brown University and the author of Techno Sapiens, a weekly newsletter about technology, psychology, and parenting. We're really excited to have both Kim and Jackie join us this evening. We would ask that if you have questions as you go along, please enter them into the chat box. We will open up to a full Q&A at the end of the session. But without further ado, thank you very much, Kim and Jackie.
Great. Thank you so much for having us. So we're going to be talking today about social media use and mental health. We're really happy that you all are here. I know this can be a tough time for people, so we appreciate you joining us and coming to listen. We're going to speak for about 30 minutes here, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Okay, so quick introductions. We already got very nice introductions from Rob, but I'm Jackie Nisi, clinical psychologist at Brown University. Okay.
And I'm Kim O'Brien, clinical social worker at Children's.
All right. So, okay. So just quickly, what we are going to cover today, roughly. So we're going to be first talking about generally what the research says about what we know about social media use and mental health. We'll be focusing mostly on the research among teens and tweens kind of age period, but we're happy to answer questions about other ages as well. We're then going to talk a little bit about top 5 tech parenting tips, and then we'll talk specifically about social media in relation to athletics for your child, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end. All right, so starting out with social media and mental health. So when you think about teen social media use and mental health, I'm curious what people think of, but oftentimes when I speak with people, this is kind of the landscape of what comes up. So lots of kind of scary headlines. You can see up on the right there, Frances Haugen, who has also been called the Facebook whistleblower, talking about the negative impacts of Facebook. Lots of headlines around negative effects. You know, Facebook knows Instagram is toxic for teen girls. And I think all of these headlines would really lead us to believe that the research is really clear on this topic, that, that social media does have clearly a negative impact on mental health. But the truth is that the research is a little bit more nuanced. Unfortunately, there's a lot of things we still don't know about the impact of social media on mental health. But we'll talk a little bit today about some of what we do know. Okay, so no surprise here to anyone, which is that kids are using social media a lot. About 97% of kids use some form of social media, and that's including things like YouTube. And basically, when we think about what is social media, we're defining it as really any kind of digital tool that allows for social interaction. So it's things like Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and YouTube, as I said. So how much are kids using it? So this number comes from a study that I'm working on right now with collaborators at UNC Chapel Hill, where I went for grad school, still recovering from last night. But in this study, here's what we did. So we had about 150 teens. Average age was 14 to 15 years old. And for 2 weeks, we had them take screenshots every day of the screen time on their phone. So if you go on your iPhone, there's kind of a screen time section in the settings, and we had them take a screenshot so that we would know exactly what they were doing on their phones without having to have them guess. And what we found is that on average, teens were picking up their phones. So that means picking it up, unlocking it 114 times per day. So that's about once every 10 minutes. We also found that teens were getting an average of about 200 notifications per day. And then when we think about actual time spent, these numbers come from the nonprofit Common Sense Media, which just released a nationally representative survey of tweens and teens. And this is particularly data from 2021, the fall of 2021. If you look at those dark green bars there. And what we see is that on average, tweens, so 8 to 12-year-olds, are spending a little over 5 hours using media, and teens are using a little over 8 hours. This does not include time spent for schoolwork or homework. It does, I will say, include multitasking. So for example, if a teen is spending 30 minutes both watching TV and on TikTok, that actually would count as an hour. But overall, this is a lot of time. But what's interesting is that when we really look at the research on this topic, it's not necessarily the idea that screen time impacts well-being. So when we do look at the research, what we see is that it's not the amount of time that's affecting outcomes like mental health and development. Instead, it really depends on some other things. So rather than time, it really depends on, first, how it's being used. So how teens are using social media. Who are they talking to? Who are they engaging with online? What are they posting? What are they sharing? What are they talking about? What are they watching? What are they being exposed to? This is sort of the content of the social media use. And we know that that plays a huge role in terms of how it's affecting teens' mental health. The next piece is who is using it. And by that, I mean that some kids are particularly vulnerable to the negative effects of social media. And some the opposite. Some are more likely to be able to take advantage of the benefits of social media. So it's really about knowing your individual kid. Some kids will have a tougher time with social media, and some will not. And then the third thing, when we think about the effects of social media, is thinking about what that time is replacing. So the time spent on social media, and if it's getting in the way of other important in-person activities like spending time with family, spending time in person with friends, or sleep. Okay, sorry, there we go. Okay, so now that we have the basics down about the research, what I want to talk about is a couple of tips for tech parenting. So parenting around social media use, particularly in teens and tweens. Although this can apply really to other ages as well. I'll mention that I've been working on distilling some of this with my colleague, Emily Weinstein. And so this is sort of a joint effort. So the first tip is communication. And in general, when we think about how we parent our kids around tech, we really want to have open, sort of ongoing conversations about it. And so there's a few ways that we can do that. There's 3 points here that I want to emphasize. 3 things that we want to do when we're talking about tech. So when we're talking about tech, in many cases, especially with teens, emotions tend to run high. And so the first thing we want to keep in mind is to be validating. So validating means that we're expressing to our kid that what they're feeling makes sense and is understandable. So this comes up a lot with tech, where maybe we don't quite understand what's going on, say, TikTok, or it seems like maybe it shouldn't be that big of a deal. But we can always express understanding of the emotion. And I'll give some examples of this, but it can be as simple as, wow, that must have been really upsetting. Or I can imagine it's really frustrating trying to manage this. We also want to be non-judgmental. So it can be really tempting when we are talking to our kids about tech to kind of roll our eyes and that kind of thing. But we really want to be, framing things as objectively and non-judgmentally as possible, which I know is easier said than done. But one key here is to avoid kind of extreme language. So, you never do this, or you always do that. We're trying to be sort of as objective as possible. And then finally, keeping it positive. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but this really means focusing on behaviors related to tech that you want to see more of in your kid rather than what we want to see less of. So focusing on the things that we like that our kids are doing. So just some examples of sort of things that may be more helpful to say along these lines of validation, non-judgmental, and things that are not so helpful. And it's not the case that the not so helpful things we would sort of never say, but they're just things to be keeping in mind that sometimes a more helpful approach can be better. So let's take a look quickly at each of these. So first, I can imagine it's stressful when your friends are texting you and you're not on your phone. So let's imagine that the issue we're facing here is that your kid is really using their phone too much, and you're trying to get them to use it less. Why is that first thing helpful? You're validating that they may be feeling stressed, and we're labeling that emotion for them and showing that it's understandable. Next up, I know for me, it's hard to take a break when I get caught up scrolling through Instagram. So here, this is good because we're relating, we're showing how they're feeling makes sense, and we're really conveying this kind of non-judgmental stance. And then finally, I love spending time with you. I want to figure out how we can spend more time together. So this is, if we're trying to get our kid to use their phone less, we can really frame it as a positive. So what we want to see more of is spending time together. And that's where we can keep our focus. The not so helpful things, just quickly on why they might be not so helpful. So it's not a big deal, just put down your phone. This can convey that, what a kid is feeling doesn't make sense or is not understandable. The sort of sentiment is like, what's wrong with you that you can't put down your phone? I will say, of course, all of these things, I know that pretty much all of us have said at some point, and that's okay. Just things to be keeping in mind. Next, why are you so addicted to your phone? So again, this creates a certain amount of judgment, particularly, using the language of addiction, which, is probably unlikely to really move the conversation forward. And then you need to stop spending so much time on your phone when we're together. Again, this is something you might eventually say to sort of set a boundary, but starting the conversation with this kind of thing may make your teen be more likely to kind of shut down and less likely to engage. Okay. Our next tip, best defense is a good offense. And by that, I mean, be proactive. So we want to be setting up kind of clear rules and expectations as much as possible in advance. And that doesn't mean that you can't go back and change your mind later, that you can't go back and add rules or add expectations or take things away, take away rules that you don't want anymore. All those things are okay. But we do want to be proactive about it. So a few things to keep in mind first, looking at the right side of this slide. We want to be thinking about really age appropriate limits. And so what's appropriate for a younger teen or preteen in terms of maybe more restrictions, it may be that as your teen ages, that you want to be loosening the reins a little bit on some of those things. You want to provide rationale. So for any rules or expectations that you're setting, it can be really helpful to just explain why up front. That can really go a long way. And then just one other thing about keep thinking twice before taking the phone away. So sometimes that's an appropriate punishment, but I think it is important just to be thinking about ways that could be, first of all, limiting some social interaction that they'd be having, making it maybe harder for you, and that it's something that you'll need to enforce. But if you do that, you just want to make sure, I think, that the kid is aware of kind of what they need to do to get the phone back, how long it'll be taken away for, just having clear guidance around it up front. And then, I get a lot of questions from families about kind of what kinds of rules to have. And this is a tough question because it's hard to say for an individual family what's the right rules. It really does depend on your preferences, the type of kid that you have, and other kind of factors. But this is just a list of a couple of rules that families might have. So you probably wouldn't have all of these, but maybe you'd have some. Just a list of examples. So You might have something around the way they interact with other people online, being respectful. You might limit the places or locations where they can use a phone. So, maybe not in the bedroom or not in the car. You might have them ask permission before doing things. You might have limits on who they can talk to on social media, times of day when you don't want them using the phone, like maybe during dinner or during homework. And as well as, parents needing to know about social media accounts. So another sort of asking for permission. And then another example is just, no, say social media use, no TikTok until homework is done. So just some examples. And I just wanted to show here, I know there's a lot going on this slide, but this is just, so on the iPhone, for those who have an iPhone, Android has something very similar called digital well-being, but on the iPhone, it's called screen time. And there's a lot of things you can do in the screen time section of your phone. You get there by going to the settings and then scrolling down to screen time. And you can, for yourself, set up kind of limits. You can set up downtime or times a day when you don't want to be getting messages. And then you can also see at the bottom here, this set up screen time for family. And that's a way that you can manage your kids' devices as well. You can sort of put them on like a family plan. Okay, so a few more of these, and then I'll hand it over to Kim. The next one is, so stay aware. And by this, I mean, there's really decades of research generally that show that parents who are more aware of what their kids are doing just day to day, that those kids, that they tend to have better relationships with their parents. The kids are less likely to get in trouble. There's sort of all kinds of positive outcomes. And so that awareness can come a lot of different ways. And, what works for each family is very different. But one way to think about this is, three categories. So ask, listen, and look. When I say ask, I mean just asking a ton of questions of your kids. So this we could think about, the 5 W's. So when they're using their phones or using social media, who are they talking to? What are they doing? What are they liking and disliking? When are they using it? Why are they doing certain things online? Where are they going online? So what apps are they using? What apps are they downloading? What websites and that kind of thing. And then the second thing is listening. So, this seems obvious, but it can be hard day to day, when we're busy. And so listening to what our kids have to say about how they're interacting with their devices, what they're doing on social media, and trying to have times where we talk about this stuff where, both we and our kids both have their devices off or down and put away. Just one tip, I think car rides can be a great time to have these conversations, and they tend to be more comfortable for kids because there's less kind of direct eye contact happening, less threatening. And so that can be a good time. And the other piece of listening that's important is we also want to listen to the bad stuff that comes up. I think sometimes kids are nervous to talk to us about bad things that are happening to them on social media because they're worried about getting phones taken away. So I think it's important that our first reaction when a kid comes to us with something negative that's happening on social media is something like, thank you so much for telling me, or I'm so glad that you came to me to talk about this, rather than what's often our knee-jerk reaction for good reason, which is, uh-oh, we need to take the phone away, or we need to, you can't go on that website anymore, or that kind of thing. And then finally, looking, and by that I mean kind of monitoring. So, keeping an eye on what your kid is doing. The way that this happens is going to vary a lot by a kid's age, and by, your family's preferences. But one key here is that there's almost never a case when you want to be spying on your kid. So unless you have really serious concerns, if you are going to be doing something like, looking at their phones or what they're doing on their phones, you want to be upfront about it. So having a conversation about it upfront, that this is part of your plan for making sure they stay safe online. And another way to do this is, to sit down with a kid and have them show you kind of what's going on in their phone. And I will say the direct kind of monitoring like this is probably more appropriate for a kid in more at the preteen or very early teen stage, and gets to be a little bit more challenging as kids get older. So 2 more tips here. One is protect sleep. This is a pretty obvious one, but the research is really clear on this, which is that using devices can really get in the way of sleep. We know that 1/3 of teens are waking up in the middle of the night to check their phones. And we know that sleep is really critical, both for mental health, for physical health, and sports performance, as I'm sure you all know. And so research does show that phones can interfere. And so, my biggest tip here is a very simple one, which is just to consider getting your kid an alarm clock, which is not their phone, and then keeping the phone out of the room when they're sleeping. And then finally, tip number 5 is recognize the positives. So, kids hear a lot about the negatives of social media, and for good reason. There are certainly negative things about social media. But I found that, when we give kids the space to kind of talk about some of the benefits of social media for them, it really opens up the conversation. And it also makes them more likely to talk about some of the bad things as well, because they feel like they're being heard around some of the positives for them. So, things like, that they can connect with their friends, that there's, funny things online that they like, videos they like watching. They can stay in touch with friends and family. All of those things may be benefits for them that they may want to talk about. And so, you can ask things to drive these kind of conversations. Ask things like, what are the best parts of growing up with social media? So those are my top 5 tips generally for social media, parenting around tech and social media. But Kim is going to talk a little more specifically about how to put this into place with your athlete.
Yeah, I thought it would just take this time to just hone in a little more specifically on your athletes and how social media can affect athletic performance and social issues related to sport. You can advance. Jackie, can you advance for me? Thanks. So like Jackie was talking about before, there are positives, right? Like social media has many benefits for athletes. So I'll talk about some of those now. So some of these are that our kids can follow the top athletes in their sport. One team that I really think is pretty cool in this regard is the U.S. Women's National Team. They're all over social media, everywhere, and they are doing some amazing things. And it's a huge, it's very inspirational to see these girls and what they're doing, not just in their sport, but also beyond sport. So if we didn't have social media, we might not be able to see all these amazing things that they're doing. The other benefits of social media in general is that it really helps young athletes develop social connections with other people, both people who they don't necessarily know, maybe not in their school or on their team, but are on the outside, but have the same interests. That's fun for kids a lot of the time, and is usually relatively harmless. And also within their own team, kids connect via Snapchat all the time. This is how they communicate. I have 4 kids myself between the ages of 9 and 13, and they're all athletes and they're all on social media. And it's like it's a really important way for them to connect. And if you have to realize, if you take it from them, it does come at a social cost. So these are things to be talking about with your kid. The other benefits of social media can be relative to sport is that you can have training knowledge and expertise literally at your fingertips. I mean, there's like on TikTok, they show, a lot of different, I've seen soccer skills on there. I've seen them on other social medias. So it's really a place where we can have this stuff where we didn't, 10 years ago, we didn't have this kind of access. So there are some real benefits here with respect to sport. The other thing too that people don't really think about or realize is that especially at really high levels. And I'm sure in mass youth soccer, there are some levels that, are pretty intense where they're practicing all the time, and there's a lot of pressure on their performance. And social media can be a nice distraction from sport for these kids. And they use it very frequently to decompress when they're not playing. And that is actually a really good benefit for these kids to have. So we also need to pay attention, though, to the fact that there are some negative effects of social media on athletes. So I'll talk about some of those now. Some negative effects are, one, that it can take time away from their working on their own sport or academics. I mean, this is if they're using it excessive amounts of time and are using it, like Jackie was talking about, what are they using it in place of? So if they're using it in place of going to practice, obviously that's a problem. If they're, using it in addition to that, it might not be as big of a deal, unless it's interfering with school, which it often can. And this other negative effect is this real dopamine rush of these endless short videos. If any of you have used TikTok, if you haven't, I would really recommend that you actually, get an account and see what it is, because I didn't know what it was until my kids started using it. And then I was looking over their shoulder and I was like, what is this? And then I was like, okay, I'm getting my own, just see what is going on here. And I got sucked in. I got absolutely 100% sucked in as a 43-year-old woman, just going through like all these little videos and like, oh, and laughing. And so it just gets you. And I think if you don't try it yourself, you don't really necessarily understand how it can suck you in and can be really addictive. So, and our kids today, like there's a New York, I think a New Yorker or New York Times article recently on TikTok, and like this whole idea, this constant dopamine rush. So what happens for kids sometimes, if they're always chasing these, the next video, the next thing, it makes it really hard for them to then transition to slower moving activities. So that can be another negative effect. Like Jackie talked about, it affects sleep. And again, I totally agree with Jackie. This is probably the biggest piece, how it would affect not just athletic performance, but just overall health and mental health. There was a really interesting study that came out recently in the NBA, and they looked at late night tweeting and found that it was associated with less time played in the game the next day, fewer points, and fewer rebounds. So the fact that something like that can be directly linked to performance should tell us something. The other negative effects that we see are that sometimes kids are being fed inaccurate sports related information. For instance, it could be about nutrition and what you should eat before a game, or what types of exercises you should do, because anyone can post on this. We don't know who's posting and what they're saying and the validity of it. So we have to be, careful that kids are taking in accurate information here. Other things that happen is kids can see pictures that provide an unrealistic body image, and not only pictures that they compare themselves to. And we see this a lot in a lot of sports, right? Where the thin ideal is important, like sports like gymnastics, figure skating, sports like that especially, but soccer too. Soccer is a lean sport typically. Typically, there are lean bodies in the sport. And when kids are constantly looking at, Instagram and TikToks or whatever they see of these other, like either college or high school or whatever athletes, pro athletes, and they're seeing what their bodies look like, they're comparing themselves to that. Because they're a soccer player too. So they're thinking, oh, my body doesn't look like that. Do I need my body to look like that to, be a pro soccer player? So especially at the younger ages, we see this a lot. And another thing we saw a lot, especially over COVID on TikTok, was things like what I eat in a day, where kids will post like what they ate in a day, and kids will hold up like a handful of almonds, and then other kids will become competitive with that and think that's all they ate, so I need to eat less. And this doesn't, of course, this doesn't happen with everybody, but I have seen this happen firsthand in our clinic at Children's with the negative impact of TikTok on eating and eating disorders among youth, especially young girls. Also, negative effects for athletes could include when they see influencers, like athletic influencers, who portray their lives as flawless. And when kids see this, they may turn to think that, you know, their life is full of flaws. If they're comparing their life and how they experience their life, their real life, and they're comparing it to what they see on Instagram posts or on TikTok, which are usually people's perfect, you know, versions of themselves, right? People have Instagrams, they have Finstas, which are fake Instagrams, which are like where they put all the stuff that they, you know, like want just for their friends and people who can see. And then they have Instagrams they put out to the world. So, you know, people have multiple accounts where they show different parts of themselves too. And we really have to think about how this impacts our kids' self-esteem, and where they're always trying to look the best they can look in front of other people. The other athletic specific negative effect of social media, and this is more for athletes who are in the public eye, but it opens them up to what we call couch criticism from the public. So if they make a statement about something that they think is important, and then the public eye can, you know, may go in and just kind of rip them about it and say, oh, that you stink, or, you know, whatever it is they want to say that's negative about either their performance or what they had to say. So kids have to understand that if they're going to post a comment that's public, it's going to be publicly responded to. And so it's helping kids navigate that sort of thing that can be really challenging. Okay, so you can move on, Jackie. So the key takeaways from the athletic piece is that it's really critical that as a parent or a coach that you're helping your athletes understand both the positive and the negative impacts of social media on them specifically. Like Jackie was talking about before, she was saying, you know, ask them about the positives. I always love to lead with the positives too with them, and say, what do you like about it? Like, what feels good about social media? And not just social media in general, break it down into the types. What social media are you on the most? What do you use it for? What do you get out of it? You know, so you're curious, you're openly curious and empathic, and want to know more about your child's use. And then, like, what feels good about that and why? And it's interesting to find out why things feel good, and to you know, gently challenge them if it seems, you know, if there seems to be a concern there. And then once you've explored all the positives, like exhaust the positives, and you can say, so what about the not so good things about social media? Like, is there anything that's not so good? And they may say something like, well, if I see my friend, this is what I hear from my kids, at least, you know, I see, and the kids I work with, but, you know, seeing other people, you know, do things like make TikToks without them, or seeing people on Snapchat, like, or, you know, reading, you know, something they posted in their private story that is hurtful. You know, there's just so many ways people can hurt each other on social media, either intentionally or unintentionally. And it's important that you and your child explore together what hurts them, because what hurts one child may not hurt another, may not even bother another. So it's really important for them to get this really nuanced understanding of their own social media use, so that they can make their own decisions about their use, because they will figure out a way to use it. I will guarantee you that. So it's not all about you know, not letting them go on any social media sites. This is not going to be helpful, because then as soon as they're old enough to be able to do it, then they're not going to be armed with the skills and the strategies they need to be able to increase the positive effects and decrease the bad ones. And they're only going to learn these things by exploring this in conversation with you and with others. So thank you so much for listening. I think we have about like 25 minutes for any questions. And this is all of our information here, websites, handles. I also put, Jackie can talk about her Technosapiens, but I also put I have a private practice, a group private practice for athletes, and all of our clinicians are athletes. So we do a lot of mental health work, and, you know, work in this area. So I put our website there. And Jackie, do you want to talk about yours?
Yeah, so you can find me on, Twitter, my website, and I also write a weekly newsletter called Technosapiens, where I write about a lot of topics like what we covered today, as well as some others. So I hope you will join me over there if you're interested. And then over on the right here is a QR code for a quick feedback survey if you have a minute to spare, where this is a QR code. So you just hold your phone camera up to it and it'll take you right to the website. And we are happy to answer questions.
Esther's wondering if you could go back a couple. I'm guessing it's the negative impacts of.
Oh,
social-
yeah. Yep.
Yeah, we can put that up further.
Oops. This one?
I think so. Not sure.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Sure. And you don't have to write the questions in the chat either. If you'd rather just kind of speak up. I don't know, Rob, are you gonna, I don't know, moderate? Are people just gonna go for it and just speak away?
I'll open up with the first question, and then I'm sure some more people will jump in. So lots of parents on the call tonight, but also lots of coaches. So Kim, I'm curious on your thoughts on best practices for managing social media for teams and the potential positives and negatives it can have in relation to both athlete mental health and wellness and also team performance.
That's a good question. So when you say managing it for teams, do you mean like the person who's managing like the team sites and that sort of thing? Or do you mean like the individual coach and how they're managing their own players' social media use?
So I would say more so for youth athletes, it's going to be based around kind of team group messages, team-based accounts, more so than the college level where you have a coach who's quite often checking your every move on whichever social media site you're on.
I think it's really important to set an expectation with social media. You know, you set coaches' expectations for practices, for this, you know, for parent involvement, all those things. Social media should be addressed there. Like, you know, if you're using GroupMe or whatever you're using for the way you are connecting, the boundaries that there need to be boundaries set of like, what do you use this for? What is, you know, so that you're not getting into these, you know, we don't want these kids getting into, you know, arguments or having things go on that get unruly in these sort of situations. So I think it's important that you set that expectation right away for what that's for. I also think it's important for coaches at, you know, the start of every season to have a quick discussion of how when people, if they have public accounts that other people, especially as they're young and learning these things, like your public accounts can be seen by anybody. So how you portray yourself on your own individual accounts also affects how our team is viewed, because you are a member of our team. And so it's very important that you are respectful on social media, that you, you know, are the best, you know, you are kind to others, you know, whatever the things are that you feel are important for your players to know, because others will be looking at them. Like if they're on there with their soccer, you know, with their uniform on and they're doing some thing and holding their middle fingers up or something like that, I mean, that looks bad for the organization. So, I mean, it's important that our coaches have these conversations with these kids. And we often think as adults that kids should know this stuff because we're adults. And so we think, yeah, how would you not know that you shouldn't be like, you know, doing, you know, some sexualized move while you're wearing your, you know, your uniform and kicking a soccer ball around or whatever and post it. But these are kids who they're kids. Their brains aren't fully developed yet. They don't have that capacity for abstract thought a lot of the time. So they're gonna have an impulse and they're gonna do it. So if they are told, if they're being talked to ahead of time about this and what the effects could be, then it might give them a little more of a pause before they do something like that.
Thank you. Very, very helpful. And this one will probably go to both of you. Can you talk about some of the links between social media and anxiety and depression in teens, which seems to be rising exponentially?
You want to start, Jackie?
Yeah, Sure, sure. Yeah, so I think this is one of those things, like I said at the beginning, where I think the research is still ongoing. So I don't think we have necessarily clear answers around, is social media causing more depression in kids or something like that. I think what we do know at this point is that social media can have both a positive and a negative impact on some of these things. And that's true for kids who might already be struggling with things like depression or anxiety as well. On the one hand, I think social media can provide, social support, which is really important when it comes to mental health concerns. It can provide a place to connect, to find resources, to deal with some of these concerns. But the negative is that it can lead to things like social comparison, which we know can cause a decrease in mood. It can also be a place where, just like Kim was talking about, inaccurate information. It can be a place where there's inaccurate information about mental health concerns as well. So a lot of information about, here's how you diagnose this thing, or the 5 signs that you have anxiety or something like that, and coming from people who really are not mental health professionals. And so I think that is that's something to be aware of. And what I would say is it really does come down to the individual kid, or the individual person, and thinking about, for them, how is social media helpful and how is it harmful, and what might they need to change about the ways that they use social media in order to have it be sort of healthier for them. Any thoughts on that, Kim? Or?
I guess the only thing I'd add is there are some groups for whom research is showing has a real positive effect. Social media has a very positive effect, and that's the LGBTQ youth community. And that's important because for a lot of these kids who are, sexual or gender minority youth, they may not yet be out to certain people in their lives. And so to have a place where they feel safe for that to happen, I believe that's probably why we're seeing that there is actually some more positive benefits on mental health for that group than others. And so I think it's important to realize too that, like Jackie was saying, every kid's different. And there are some groups where having that safe space may actually give a lot of benefit that we don't necessarily think about. So we got this question here. I'll read it out loud because, Jackie, I think this would be a good one for you. Is there a number of hours a day that is generally recommended screen time limit for middle school age kids? Would that include both TV and phones combined?
This is such a good question, and I get it all the time, and I really wish that there was a specific number that that was recommended. So, there used to be the American Academy of Pediatrics would put out, I think at the time it was like 2 hours or something like that. And then they got rid of it because they realized it was unrealistic and that it was just too general. Like, there's so many different things that kids could be doing on screens that then just setting a cutoff at a certain time was not helpful. But what I would say to this is just to be thinking about in your family, thinking about the balance of what are the things that you want your kids to be doing. So off of screens. So maybe you want to make sure they're doing their homework. You want to make sure that they're spending some time with their family, that they're getting outside, they're going to practice, they're exercising. I would sort of account for all of those things first, and then see how much time you have left over. And that time that's left over is time that could be spent using screens, and it's time that could be spent doing something else. In terms of the TV and phones, I do think you might want to have kind of separate limits or rules around TV versus phones. I think obviously the things that are happening on those two devices would be very different. in some cases. I think one thing that can be good about TV is that it can be watched together with your kids. So whereas it's a lot harder to do that on a phone. But one thing that tends to be better about a phone is that there can be more interaction happening with other people. So a kid might be, texting with their friends, which could be a really good thing. So you might want to think about those two things in kind of different categories, I think.
Yeah, I'd add to that too, that it's important for families to have guidelines and expectations about use. And it's also important that the kids can feel they can advocate for changes as time goes by. I'll give an example from my household. So my kid, that's what Jackie showed, the screen time. I limit all my kids' screen time on their phones. And once they hit the limit, they have to ask you for more. So you get to choose as a parent if you want to grant it to them or not. Okay. So anyway, long story short, what my 13-year-old said, Mom, I want to have a conversation with you. She's like, don't yell at me and don't say no. She knows that my gut is to say, no, you don't need any more screen time. Like, just go outside and play. Or, like all us parents of that age kids just want our kids to go out and play and just get off the phones, get off the screens. But she was able to have a legit negotiation conversation with me about why she feels she wants more time. And if I do extend it and I notice that she's taking time away from homework or other things, that we can change it back. So, and I think that this is what I think is cool about social media, because this is giving an opportunity for a conversation about independence that I really don't think I ever had when I was growing up. It just didn't exist. And now our kids are being able to learn more about themselves and about how social media affects them, and learn how to regulate themselves and be able to say, you know what, when I looked at that Instagram post, I felt sad and it made me feel left out. And maybe I need to just delete Instagram for a week or just not use it for a little bit. And kids can then learn to make their own decisions about it. So I do think that it's actually a pretty cool opportunity. We can look at it for kids to learn how to self-regulate and learn how to understand how certain things impact them emotionally, and then how they can change their behavior so that they feel a little bit better.
Someone asked, are there any further resources you recommend? The one place that I always like to direct people to is a website called Common Sense Media. I don't know if other people are familiar with that, but they've got a ton of different resources. So resources directed to parents, directed to kids themselves. They do reviews of, every app that's out there. So if a new app comes out and your kid's interested in downloading it, you can look it up and see, is it appropriate for them? Is it something you want or not want? They have research there. They have tons of stuff. So Common Sense Media, I would definitely recommend. Yeah, someone says Common Sense is great to figure out age appropriate movies. Such a good point, because they review movies, TV shows, all that too.
Another thing at Children's is we have a whole department on media. Michael Rich is if you Google Boston Children's Hospital, Michael Rich Media, you will find that he has a lot of information on there too. So hopefully that might be helpful too. And it's not just social media, it's all media. What else? Any other questions people have or concerns?
Maureen, you have your hand raised if you'd like to unmute your mic.
Thank you, Rob. Good evening, Jackie and Kimberly. I figured this would be easier to say instead of type. But my question is to both of you. How do you convince or advise children in today's society to exercise responsible social media etiquette when they see adults and even their famous role models being disrespectful, unkind, and antagonistic on every platform?
A great question. Kim, you want to start?
Sure. I do think it starts at home too. And I say that as a parent who I'm on my phone a lot for work and everything. And my my children see me and they say, "Oh my gosh, mom, you're on your phone and you're not even talking to me. Oh my," they're like pointing me out, of course, but that's where it starts, right? So if you're modeling good things in your home, okay, and when I make those mistakes, I'm a human being. I make mistakes and I get too fixated on the phone, and then I'm like, "Oh my God, I'm sorry. You're right. Okay, you have my full attention now." So I think by starting at home, then that opens it up to, if you're modeling good things for them, then that opens it up to, wow, look at what that person just said to this person on or like commented on their I don't know, on their Snapchat store or whatever, that look what that person said. Like, what do you think that's like? Why do you think they did that? What do you think that's about? And like, have a conversation about it with your kid so that they can realize that they don't, just because they see some adult doing some horrible thing, it doesn't mean they have to follow in those footsteps. That you can use as a platform to have a discussion about it and to communicate about, like, what do you think is going to happen now for him when he tries to go back to his team after he's just did this, or making this up, but and so really kind of having them think about it, especially teenagers who have a little more capacity for abstract thought than some of the younger kids. Like, what do you think like will happen for this person? So I would just use it as a jumping off point for the critical communication piece between parents and kids. Anything else, Jackie, on that?
Those are all great points. Yeah, modeling, use it as a conversation starter. The only other thing I guess I'd say is that I think it can be part of sort of the larger conversations that you have with your kids about values and what's important to you and what's okay behavior and not okay behavior just generally. And that, making it clear to them that carries over into social media too, because I think sometimes kids see social media as, or phones, as sort of this whole separate thing that's not really doesn't really count as real life. And so I think being explicit about, these things we talk about that are important for in person, like that all applies when it comes to online too.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
And also one last little piece about that, helping kids see too that you don't have to fight battles on social media. Like, this happened with my kid the other day. She showed me this Snapchat post that one of her friends did that was really mean about another kid. And she's like, "Mom, what should I say? Like, what should I say back on this?" And I'm like, you shouldn't. You should talk to her in person at school and tell her that what she did, and why that like doesn't feel right, or and so it's kind of teaching them, like, you don't need to do everything on social media. You don't have to respond and like immediately like oh do this impulsively respond. It's like, let's actually have a conversation about this outside, which is hard to convince kids and teens about nowadays. So any more things in here? Let's see.
People are talking about the importance of modeling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll wait for a minute or so, see if any additional questions come in, but we will take this opportunity to thank you so much for the incredible presentation and resources that you shared, Dr. Jackie and Dr. Kim. We're very excited to work with Boston Children's Hospital on a continuing basis, and we will share the video and many of the resources that you've identified tonight as well. So thank you so much. A really important topic, and incredibly well done.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us. Have a good night.